The gunshot that tore through the stillness of Clearwater Springs that Sunday morning wasn't meant to kill, only to warn. But it changed Nora Collins' life forever, as surely as if the bullet had struck her heart instead of the dirt at her feet. Banished Nora's hands trembled as she clutched the frayed edges of her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the early morning chill of April 1874 seeping through the thin fabric. The wooden steps of the Clearwater Springs Baptist Church felt different beneath her feet today. For 5 years she'd climbed these same steps every Sunday, but never before had they seemed so steep, so forbidding. Behind her, the whispers followed like shadows. The audacity, Mrs. Henderson hissed to her companion, coming to God's house in her condition. Nora kept her eyes forward, chin raised despite the burning shame that colored her cheeks. At 22, she had become the subject of the town's most vicious gossip. 6 months pregnant, unmarried, and alone since Thomas Parker had fled town upon learning of her condition. The father of her child had promised marriage, promised devotion, promised everything a young woman could dream of until the moment he disappeared on the westbound stage, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note about opportunities in California. As she reached for the heavy wooden door, a firm hand gripped her elbow. Reverend Stillwater, his gray beard nearly touching his black vestments, stood blocking her path. "Miss Collins." His voice was loud enough to ensure the gathering congregation could hear. "I believe we need to speak privately." Nora felt the eyes of everyone upon her, burning into her back as the Reverend guided her away from the entrance, around the side of the whitewashed church building. The morning sun had not yet reached this shadowed spot, and she shivered more from dread than cold. "I cannot allow you to enter the Lord's house today," Reverend Stillwater said without preamble, "but Reverend, the deacons and I have discussed your situation." His eyes flickered momentarily to her swollen belly before returning to her face with renewed hardness. "This congregation will not abide flagrant sin in its midst. Your presence would be a disruption and an affront to the godly families of this community." Nora felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet. The church had been her anchor since arriving in Clearwater Springs as a 17-year-old orphan. After losing her parents to influenza in Missouri, she'd come west on her uncle's invitation, only to have him pass 6 months later. The church had become her family, its members her support until now. "Where am I to go for guidance?" she whispered. "For forgiveness." "The Lord's forgiveness is available to all who truly repent," Reverend Stillwater said, his voice softening slightly. "But the church must maintain its standards. Perhaps after the child is born, arrangements can be made. There are homes for unwed mothers and their offspring in Denver. You want me to give up my baby?" Nora's voice rose, one hand protectively covering her belly. "It would be the Christian thing to do," he replied. "To give the child a chance at a proper family, to restore your standing in the community." "No," the word came out stronger than she expected. The Reverend's compassionate expression hardened once more. "Then I'm afraid you leave us no choice. Until you come to your senses and demonstrate true repentance, you are not welcome in this congregation." She stood frozen as he turned and walked back toward the church entrance, where curious onlookers had gathered. Humiliation burned through her as she realized everyone had been watching this exchange, their expressions ranging from righteous satisfaction to uncomfortable pity. With nowhere else to go, Nora turned and began walking down the dusty main street, away from the church, away from the only community she'd known since coming west. Mrs. Peterson, who owned the boarding house where Nora had a small room, had already hinted that such accommodations weren't suitable for women in her condition. The seamstress shop where she worked had been receiving fewer customers since her pregnancy began to show. She had perhaps 2 weeks of savings, no family, and now no church. The child within her kicked as if sensing her distress. "It's all right," she whispered, though tears threatened to spill. "We'll be all right," but she wasn't sure how. Blake Matheson pulled his hat lower against the morning sun as he guided his wagon into Clearwater Springs. The 2-day journey from his ranch had left him dusty and irritable, but he needed supplies and the occasional human contact beyond his ranch hands. At 30, Blake had established himself as one of the more successful cattle ranchers in the territory, though he kept largely to himself. His ranch, the Double M, lay 15 miles outside of town, close enough for convenience, but far enough to maintain his privacy. He preferred it that way. 10 years in Colorado territory had taught him that people were generally more trouble than they were worth. As he approached the center of town, the unusual commotion caught his attention. Sunday mornings in Clearwater Springs typically meant empty streets while the town's residents attended church services. But today, a crowd had gathered outside the Baptist church, and even from a distance, Blake could see it wasn't the normal post-service socializing. None of his business, he reminded himself, steering his wagon toward Wilson's general store. He had planned to arrive early enough to avoid the after-church crowd, get his supplies, and be on his way back to the ranch before noon. As he tied his horses to the hitching post, a young woman hurried past, her head bowed and shoulders shaking. Something about her obvious distress made him look twice. He recognized Nora Collins, the quiet seamstress who had altered his shirts last winter. She had always been polite but reserved during their few interactions, nothing like the distraught figure rushing past him now. Blake hesitated only a moment before calling out, "Miss Collins?" She startled, looking up with tear-streaked cheeks. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed immediately by embarrassment. "Mr. Matheson, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there." It was then he noticed what he had somehow missed before the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath her dress. Understanding dawned as he glanced back toward the church, where Reverend Stillwater was now addressing the gathered congregation with animated gestures. "Are you all right, Miss Collins?" he asked, though the answer was plainly written across her face. "Yes, of course," she said automatically, wiping at her cheeks. "Just feeling a bit unwell this morning." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you'll excuse me." She turned to continue down the street, but swayed slightly, one hand shooting out to steady herself against the nearest building. Blake moved without thinking, crossing to her side in 3 long strides. "You need to sit down." "I'm fine, truly," she protested, but her pale face suggested otherwise. "You're about to faint is what you are," he said bluntly. "Come on, Wilson's has a bench inside. You can rest while I do my business." "I don't want to be a bother, it's no bother," he interrupted, surprising himself with his insistence. Blake wasn't one to involve himself in others' problems, yet here he was, offering his arm to a clearly distressed pregnant woman who had just been, if his assumption was correct, thrown out of church. After a moment's hesitation, Nora accepted his assistance, allowing him to guide her toward the store. As they passed the church, several onlookers turned to stare, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. Blake felt Nora tense beside him, her fingers tightening on his arm. "Head high," he murmured. "Don't give them the satisfaction." She drew a shaky breath and straightened her shoulders, though her eyes remained fixed on the ground ahead of them. Inside Wilson's general store, the proprietor looked up in surprise. Harold Wilson was a rotund man in his 50s with perpetually ink-stained fingers from tallying his ledgers. "Blake, didn't expect to see you today," his greeting faltered as he noticed Nora. "Miss Collins." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Wilson's wife emerged from the back room, her friendly smile vanishing when she spotted Nora. "Mr. Wilson," Blake said evenly, "Miss Collins isn't feeling well. Might she sit for a moment while I gather my supplies?" Wilson exchanged a look with his wife before reluctantly nodding toward the wooden bench by the pot-bellied stove. "I suppose that would be all right." "Thank you," Nora murmured, letting Blake lead her to the seat. Once settled, she kept her eyes downcast, hands folded protectively over her belly. Blake turned his attention to his supply list, moving efficiently through the store as he gathered flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and other necessities. All the while, he was acutely aware of the whispered conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, their disapproving glances toward Nora not escaping his notice. When he approached the counter to pay, Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat pointedly. Mr. Matheson, a word if you please. Blake raised an eyebrow but followed the woman a few steps away. I don't mean to speak out of turn, she began in a hushed tone, but you should know that Miss Collins has fallen into disgrace. The father of her child abandoned her months ago, and this morning Reverend Stillwater was forced to exclude her from the congregation. Forced. Blake repeated, keeping his voice equally low. Well, naturally, a woman in her condition, unmarried, it sets a terrible example for the young ladies of the community. Mrs. Wilson's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. I'm surprised she had the nerve to show her face in church at all. Blake studied the woman's righteous expression for a moment. Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate your concern, but I don't recall asking for town gossip along with my supplies. The woman's face reddened. I merely thought, I believe I can form my own judgments, he interrupted, turning back to the counter where Mr. Wilson was tallying his purchases. After paying, Blake gathered his supplies and approached Nora, who looked marginally better after resting. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Matheson, she said softly, rising to her feet. I should be on my way now. Where are you headed? He asked. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. To my room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, I suppose, though I'm not certain how much longer I'll be welcome there. Blake hesitated, an internal debate raging. He had always maintained his distance from the town's affairs, preferring the solitude of his ranch and the straightforward company of his ranch hands. Getting involved with a woman, especially one in Nora's situation, would only invite complications he didn't need, and yet, something about her quiet dignity in the face of the town's cruelty struck a chord within him. Miss Collins, he said finally, I have a proposition for you. Her eyes widened slightly, a wary expression crossing her face. Not that kind of proposition, he clarified quickly. I'm in need of someone to help manage the household at the Double M. My previous housekeeper left 2 months ago to marry a miner in Silverton, and the place has been in disarray since. You're offering me employment? Nora asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Room and board included, Blake continued. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. You'd have your own quarters in the main house. But my condition is none of my business, he interrupted. Can you cook? Yes, quite well actually. Can you keep accounts? I managed the ledgers at my uncle's store before he passed. Then you're qualified. Blake shrugged as if the matter were settled. The pay isn't much, but you won't have to worry about shelter or food. Nora studied him carefully. Why would you do this for me? You hardly know me. It was a fair question, one Blake wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Let's just say I've never had much patience for people who mistake cruelty for righteousness, he said finally. Besides, I really do need a housekeeper. She hesitated, clearly weighing her limited options. When would you need me to start? I'm heading back today. You're welcome to ride with me if you're ready, or I can come back for you tomorrow if you need time to gather your things. Today would be better, she said quietly. I don't have much to pack. Blake nodded, understanding the unspoken truth that staying in town even one more night would only subject her to further humiliation. I'll finish loading my supplies and meet you back here in an hour. As he turned to leave, Nora's voice stopped him. Mr. Matheson, thank you. He tipped his hat awkwardly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's just business, Miss Collins, nothing more. But as he walked back to his wagon, Blake couldn't help feeling that he'd just complicated his life in ways he couldn't possibly foresee. Nora stood in the modest room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, surveying her few possessions. Everything she owned in the world could fit into one trunk and a small carpet bag. 6 years in Clearwater Springs, and she had accumulated so little to show for it. She folded her dresses carefully, placing them in the trunk alongside her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the small collection of books she treasured. As she worked, her mind raced with uncertainty about the decision she had just made. Blake Matheson was something of a mystery in Clearwater Springs. He came to town only when necessary for supplies or occasional business at the bank. People respected him for his success, but found his reserved nature off-putting. Some called him standoffish. Others simply said he preferred his own company to that of the townspeople. What Nora knew for certain was that he had shown her more kindness in the past hour than anyone else had in months. Since her pregnancy had begun to show, she had watched former friends cross the street to avoid speaking with her. The seamstress shop where she worked had reduced her hours, citing decreased business that Nora knew was due to customers refusing to patronize an establishment employing a fallen woman. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Peterson entered without waiting for a response, her thin face pinched with disapproval as she watched Nora packing. "So the rumors are true," the older woman said. "You're going to work for Matheson out at his ranch." Nora continued folding a shawl. "Yes, Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Matheson has offered me a position as his housekeeper." "Housekeeper," Mrs. Peterson repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Nora's hands stilled, her cheeks burning. "It's precisely what he's offered me, nothing more." "I'm sure it is, dear," Mrs. Peterson said with false sympathy. "Though I can't imagine what respectable man would want an unwed mother living under his roof, but then Matheson has always kept to himself. Perhaps he doesn't care about propriety. Mr. Matheson has been nothing but kind and respectful," Nora said firmly, resuming her packing. "Of course he has, for now." Mrs. Peterson moved closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But you should be careful, Nora. Men have certain expectations, especially of women in your situation." Nora straightened, looking the older woman directly in the eye. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Peterson. I'll be sure to keep it in mind." The boarding house owner seemed taken aback by Nora's direct gaze. She sniffed. "Well, I suppose it's for the best. Several of my other boarders have expressed discomfort with your presence. Mrs. Holloway said just yesterday that she wouldn't continue renting a room in an establishment that condones immoral behavior." The word stung, but Nora refused to let it show. "Then I'm glad my departure will ease Mrs. Holloway's conscience. I'll need the key when you leave," Mrs. Peterson said, businesslike now. "And I've calculated what you owe through today." She handed Nora a slip of paper. The amount was correct to the penny, but there was no refund for the remainder of the month Nora had already paid for. She said nothing as she counted out the money, placing it in Mrs. Peterson's outstretched hand. "I wish you well, Nora," the woman said, softening slightly, "despite everything. You were always a good tenant, quiet, paid on time." She hesitated. "If things don't work out at the Matheson Ranch, I'm afraid you won't be able to return here." "I understand," Nora said quietly after Mrs. Peterson left. Nora sat heavily on the edge of her bed, one hand absently stroking her rounded belly. The baby kicked in response, a firm reminder of why she was making this choice. "We'll be all right," she whispered, though uncertainty gnawed at her. She knew nothing about Blake Matheson beyond his reputation as a successful but solitary rancher. She was trading the familiar judgment of Clearwater Springs for the unknown of a remote cattle ranch 15 miles from town, but what choice did she have? Her savings would last perhaps another week. No one in town would hire her now. The church had cast her out, and her landlady had made it clear she wasn't welcome to stay. With renewed determination, Nora finished her packing and closed the trunk. Blake Matheson had offered her a chance, and whatever his reasons, she couldn't afford to refuse it. An hour later, she stood next to Blake's wagon in front of Wilson's store, watching as he loaded her trunk alongside his supplies. A small crowd had gathered nearby, not bothering to disguise their interest in this development. "Just ignore them," Blake said quietly as he secured the trunk. "I'm getting rather practiced at that," Nora replied with a faint smile. He helped her up onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. As he took the reins, Reverend Stillwater approached, his expression grave beneath his wide-brimmed black hat. "Mr. Matheson," he called. "A word, if you please." Blake's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Reverend. I feel it's my Christian duty to inform you that taking Miss Collins into your home may give rise to speculation." "Is that so?" Blake's voice remained neutral, though Nora noticed his knuckles whitening on the reins. "Indeed. As a man of some standing in this community, you should consider how such an arrangement might be perceived." Miss Collins has made choices that place her outside the bounds of respectable society. Blake was silent for a moment, surveying the small crowd that had gathered to witness this exchange. Then he turned back to the Reverend. "Tell me, Reverend Stillwater, which part of judge not, lest ye be judged, has your congregation been struggling with lately?" The minister's face flushed. "Mr. Matheson, I hardly think Miss Collins is my employee," Blake interrupted. "Nothing more, nothing less. And unlike some in this town, I prefer to offer help rather than condemnation to those in need." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Reverend." With that, he flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Nora kept her gaze fixed ahead, not daring to look back at the town that had been her home for 6 years. Only when they had passed the last buildings and were on the open road did she release the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Blake kept his eyes on the road. "Do what? Defend me? Challenge the Reverend like that?" He shrugged. "I just don't care for hypocrisy, that's all." They rode in silence for several miles, the rolling landscape of the Colorado foothills stretching before them. Spring had brought a touch of green to the prairie grasses, and wildflowers dotted the terrain. In different circumstances, Nora might have found the journey pleasant. "It's about 3 hours to the ranch," Blake said eventually. "We'll stop halfway to rest the horses. Are you comfortable enough?" Nora nodded. "Yes, thank you." "I should warn you about the place," he continued. "It's not what you might be used to. The main house is decent enough, 2 stories, built it myself when I first claimed the land, but it's been neglected since Mrs. Abernathy left to get married." "I'm sure it's fine," Nora assured him. "I'm not afraid of hard work. There are 4 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse: Jesse, Miguel, Caleb, and Sam. Good men, all of them. They take their meals in the main house, so you'd be cooking for 6, including yourself." "And the baby eventually," Nora added hesitantly. Blake glanced at her briefly. "Yes, of course. Does that concern you, having a baby at the ranch?" He seemed to consider this. "Can't say I've given it much thought, never been around many babies. But I reckon people have been having them since the beginning of time, so we'll manage." His matter-of-fact response eased some of Nora's tension. For months, her pregnancy had been treated as some kind of catastrophe by everyone around her. Blake's practical attitude was refreshing. "When is it due?" he asked after another stretch of silence. "July, the doctor thinks. Around the middle of the month," Blake nodded. "Hot time of year for such business, but the house stays fairly cool if you keep the windows right." As they continued their journey, Nora found herself studying her new employer from the corner of her eye. Blake Matheson was taller than average, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work. His face was weathered from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was perhaps in his early 30s. A short, neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw, and beneath his hat, she could see dark brown hair in need of a trim. He wasn't what most would call handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his steady presence. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, asking nothing of the world but to be left to his own devices. Why such a man would involve himself in her troubles, Nora couldn't begin to guess. But as the wagon rolled steadily toward the Double M Ranch, she found herself grateful for whatever impulse had prompted him to offer her this lifeline when she needed it most. Blake kept his eyes on the road ahead, though he was acutely aware of the woman beside him. What in God's name had possessed him to offer her a position at his ranch? 10 years of carefully maintaining his distance from the entanglements of Clearwater Springs, and in one impulsive moment, he had invited its most controversial resident to live under his roof. Mrs. Abernathy's departure 2 months ago had left a significant void at the Double M. The elderly widow had kept the main house in impeccable order, cooked meals that made even the most hardened ranch hands show up early to the table, and managed the household accounts with precision. Since she'd left to marry a silver miner in Silverton, the ranch had gradually descended into a state of disorganization that even Blake could no longer ignore. Still, he could have hired someone else. Someone without complications. Someone who wouldn't have Reverend Stillwater and half the town wagging their tongues about impropriety. And yet, Watching Nora Collins being cast out by people who claimed to follow a compassionate God had stirred something in him he'd thought long buried, a sense of righteous anger, a desire to stand against injustice. Perhaps it was because it reminded him too much of his own past, of lessons learned the hard way about the hypocrisy of those who claimed moral superiority. "There's a creek up ahead," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "We'll stop there to rest the horses and have some lunch." Nora nodded, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "That would be welcome, thank you." The creek cut through a small meadow dotted with spring wildflowers. Blake guided the wagon to a shady spot beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, where the babbling water provided a peaceful soundtrack. After helping Nora down from the wagon, noting how she tried to hide her discomfort from the long ride, he unhitched the horses to let them drink and graze. "Mrs. Abernathy packed some food before we left this morning," he said, retrieving a cloth-wrapped bundle from the wagon. "Nothing fancy, just some bread, cheese, and apples." "That sounds perfect," Nora said, carefully lowering herself to sit on a fallen log. Blake handed her the bundle and a canteen of water before settling a respectful distance away. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the tension gradually easing as the peaceful surroundings worked their subtle magic. "May I ask you something, Mr. Matheson?" Nora finally ventured. "Blake," he corrected. "If you're going to be living at the ranch, you might as well use my given name." "Blake," she repeated, the name sounding strangely intimate on her lips. "And you can call me Nora," he nodded, waiting for her question. "Why did you really offer me this position?" She asked directly. "And please don't say it's just because you needed a housekeeper. Half the widows in Clearwater Springs would have jumped at the chance." Blake considered deflecting, but decided she deserved honesty. "I suppose I know something about being judged unfairly," he said after a moment. "About having people decide who you are based on circumstances rather than character." Nora studied him with curious eyes. "You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I came to Colorado Territory 10 years ago from Missouri. Left behind some unpleasantness." "What kind of unpleasantness?" Blake hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, preferring to leave those memories buried, but there was something about Nora's direct gaze that made evasion seem dishonest. "I was accused of something I didn't do," he said finally. "A wealthy man's daughter claimed I had compromised her virtue after her father caught us together. In truth, she'd been pursuing me for months and I'd kept my distance. But when faced with her father's anger, she claimed I had forced my attentions on her." Nora's eyes widened. "That's terrible. What happened?" "Her father was the most influential man in the county. My word against hers meant nothing. I was given a choice: marry her or face prison." Blake's jaw tightened at the memory. "I chose neither. I left that night, heading west with what little I could carry." "You built all this, your ranch, your life, from nothing," Nora said softly. "Not exactly nothing. I had some education and wasn't afraid of hard work." Blake shrugged. "But yes, I started fresh. Worked cattle drives, saved every penny, claimed this land when I had enough for a stake. And you've been alone all this time?" The question caught him off guard. "I have my ranch hands, occasional business in town, it's enough." Nora seemed unconvinced but didn't press further. "Well, thank you for sharing that with me, and for giving me a chance when no one else would." Blake felt suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Like I said, I needed a housekeeper. This arrangement benefits us both." They finished their meal and continued their journey. As they crested a hill in the late afternoon sun, Blake pointed to the valley below. "There it is. The Double M." The ranch spread out before them, a 2-story main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. In the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grasslands that stretched toward the mountains. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was substantial, representing 10 years of Blake's sweat and determination. Nora leaned forward slightly, taking in her new home. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Something about her genuine appreciation made Blake see his property through fresh eyes. He'd been so focused on work for so long that he rarely paused to appreciate what he'd built. "It serves its purpose," he said, though he couldn't keep a note of pride from his voice. As they approached the main house, two of the ranch hands emerged from the barn. Jesse Thompson, Blake's foreman, raised a hand in greeting, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he noticed Nora beside Blake. "Boss, didn't expect you back so soon," Jesse called, approaching the wagon as Blake brought it to a halt. "Made good time," Blake replied, jumping down. "Jesse, this is Miss Nora Collins. She'll be taking over as housekeeper." Jesse removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray, streaked red hair. "Madam, it's a pleasure. We've been living like savages since Mrs. Abernathy left." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Thompson," Nora replied with a smile. Blake moved to help her down from the wagon, aware of Jesse's curious glance at her condition but grateful when his foreman made no comment. "Let me show you to your quarters," Blake said, retrieving Nora's trunk from the wagon. "You must be tired from the journey." The main house was indeed in a state of disarray, though not as bad as Blake had feared. The front room had a large stone fireplace, comfortable if somewhat worn furniture, and bookshelves lining one wall. Dust had accumulated on surfaces and dishes were stacked haphazardly in the kitchen, but the space was fundamentally sound. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Blake explained as he carried her trunk. "Mine is at the end of the hall. There's an empty room between that could serve as a nursery when the time comes." Nora followed him up the stairs, moving carefully. "You've thought of everything," she said, sounding slightly surprised. The bedroom was simple but pleasant, with a double bed, a dresser, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the eastern pastures. Mrs. Abernathy had left it clean, though the air was slightly stale from disuse. "It's lovely," Nora said, running her hand along the quilt that covered the bed. "Far nicer than my room at the boarding house." "The washroom is downstairs, I'm afraid," Blake said, setting down her trunk. "There's a pump in the kitchen for water. For bathing, we heat water on the stove. It's not fancy, it's perfect," Nora interrupted. "Truly, I'm grateful." Blake shifted uncomfortably under her earnest gaze. "Well, I'll let you get settled. Dinner's usually at 6, but given the circumstances, don't worry about cooking tonight. The boys and I can manage." "Nonsense," Nora said, already removing her shawl. "Cooking dinner is the least I can do after everything you've done for me. Just give me a few minutes to freshen up and I'll see what supplies we have to work with." Blake wanted to protest but recognized the determination in her eyes. "All right, but tomorrow is soon enough to take on full duties." "You've had a long day." As he turned to leave, Nora called his name, stopping him at the door. "I want you to know," she said softly, "that I understand this arrangement is purely professional. I won't cause you any trouble and I'll earn my keep. You have my word." Blake nodded, unsure how to respond to the sincerity in her voice. "Get some rest," he said finally. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." As he descended the stairs, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that despite Nora's assurances, his carefully ordered life had just become infinitely more complicated. The Double M Ranch quickly began to transform under Nora's care. Within a week, the main house was spotless. Meals appeared on the table with impressive regularity, and even the ranch hands had taken to removing their hats and wiping their boots before entering the kitchen. For Nora, the work was a welcome distraction from her uncertain future. Each morning, she rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Blake and the hands before they headed out to their daily tasks. The days were filled with cleaning, baking, mending, and gradually bringing order to the household accounts that had fallen into disarray during Mrs. Abernathy's absence. In the evenings, after serving dinner and cleaning the kitchen, Nora often sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. These quiet moments became precious to her, a time to rest her swollen feet and feel the baby's movements, to contemplate the strange turn her life had taken. Blake maintained a respectful distance, their interactions limited primarily to meals and brief conversations about household matters. He was unfailingly polite but guarded, retreating to his study most evenings with account books or correspondence from cattle buyers. The ranch hands, however, had embraced Nora's presence with enthusiasm. Jesse Thompson, the foreman, treated her with grandfatherly affection, often bringing wildflowers he'd spotted while riding the range. Miguel Vasquez, whose family had ranched in the territory for generations, delighted in teaching her Spanish cooking techniques. Young Caleb Johnson, barely 20 and far from his Pennsylvania home, blushed furiously whenever she spoke to him directly. And Sam Winter, a former Buffalo soldier who rarely spoke of his past, would quietly repair anything she mentioned needed fixing. 2 weeks after her arrival, Nora was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were rare at the Double M, especially unannounced ones. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, surprised to see Reverend Stillwater and 2 church deacons climbing down from a buggy. Blake emerged from the barn, walking toward the unexpected guests with visible reluctance. Though Nora couldn't hear their conversation, the Reverend's gesturing and Blake's increasingly rigid posture suggested it wasn't a social call. When the front door opened minutes later, Nora had composed herself, returning to her bread-making with deliberate focus. Blake's footsteps were followed by the heavier tread of the visitors. "Miss Collins," Reverend Stillwater's voice carried a forced pleasantness. "How unexpected to find you looking so well." Nora turned, wiping her hands again on her apron. "Reverend, gentlemen, this is a surprise." "The Reverend and the deacons have come to discuss church business," Blake said, his expression carefully neutral. "I explained they could have sent a letter and saved themselves the journey." "We felt this matter required a personal touch," said Deacon Harris, a thin man with perpetually pursed lips. "The church building needs significant repairs before winter, and we're calling on all Christians in the area to contribute." "I see," Nora said quietly, understanding now. They had come for money, not out of concern for her welfare. "Indeed," Reverend Stillwater continued. "Mr. Matheson has been generous in the past, though his attendance has been irregular. Non-existent would be more accurate," Blake said dryly. "I believe the last time I set foot in your church was for Old Man Gunderson's funeral 3 years ago. Nevertheless, as a prominent landowner in the region, your support sets an example," Deacon Weber added. He was staring at Nora's rounded belly with poorly disguised disapproval. "And what example would that be?" Blake asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Supporting an institution that turns away those most in need of compassion." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Nora busied herself with punching down the bread dough, wishing she could disappear. "Mr. Matheson," Reverend Stillwater began carefully, "the church must uphold certain standards of moral conduct. Surely you understand that." "What I understand," Blake replied, "is that you've ridden 15 miles to ask for my money while simultaneously judging my household arrangements." "That strikes me as remarkably poor strategy, Reverend." "We meant no offense," Deacon Harris backpedaled. "Miss Collins's situation is unfortunate, but the church's position remains clear on such matters." "Then so does mine," Blake said firmly. "I won't be contributing to your roof repairs, gentlemen, not until your church remembers what Christianity is supposed to be about." The men exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by Blake's directness. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Reverend Stillwater suggested with a pointed look at Nora. "There's nothing to discuss that can't be said in front of Miss Collins," Blake replied. "She's a member of this household now." "That's precisely what concerns us," Deacon Weber said, abandoning pretense. "The arrangement here is irregular. People are talking, Mr. Matheson." "Let them talk," Blake said dismissively. "I've never much cared for gossip. Your reputation is my own concern." Nora finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Gentlemen, I understand your discomfort with my presence here, but I assure you Mr. Matheson has been nothing but proper and kind in offering me employment when no one else would. If you're truly concerned about Christian charity, perhaps that's where your focus should be." Reverend Stillwater's face flushed. "Young woman, your situation is of your own making. Actions have consequences." "Yes," Nora agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. "And one of those consequences has been learning who truly lives by Christ's teachings and who merely preaches them." Blake's eyebrows rose slightly at her bold response, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his face before his expression returned to impassive. "I believe we've taken enough of your time," he said to the visitors. "Jesse can show you back to your buggy." The men had little choice but to leave, their mission unsuccessful and their disapproval evident. As the door closed behind them, Nora sagged against the kitchen table, the confrontation having drained her remaining energy. "I apologize," she said softly. "I shouldn't have spoken to them that way." "Why not?" Blake asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee and sliding one toward her. "You only spoke the truth." "Still, they're already convinced I'm a fallen woman. Now they'll add disrespectful to my sins." Blake's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "From what I've seen, their approval isn't worth much anyway." Nora accepted the coffee gratefully, easing herself into a chair. "They'll spread more rumors now, about both of us. Let them," Blake said with a shrug. "Clearwater Springs is 15 miles away. Out here, we answer to no one but ourselves." His words were reassuring, yet Nora couldn't help worrying. Her reputation was already in tatters, but Blake's wasn't. By defending her, by allowing her to stay at the Double M, he was risking the standing he'd built over a decade. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Stand up for me this way." Blake was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answer might be found there. "I told you about leaving Missouri," he said finally. "What I didn't tell you was that after I was accused, not a single person in that town, not one friend, not one neighbor stood up and questioned whether it might not be true. They all believed the worst of me because it was easier than challenging a powerful man." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I swore then that I'd never be like them, that I'd judge people by their character, not by convenient assumptions." Nora felt a lump form in her throat at the unexpected openness in his usually guarded expression. "Thank you," she whispered. Blake seemed embarrassed by his own candor. He cleared his throat and stood. "I should get back to work. Those fence posts in the north pasture won't fix themselves." After he left, Nora returned to her bread making, her mind replaying the conversation. In the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at the Double M, she'd begun to glimpse the man beneath Blake's reserved exterior, a man of principle and quiet integrity, who valued actions over words. It was dangerous, she knew, to admire him too much. Her position here was precarious enough without developing feelings for her employer. Yet as she shaped the dough into loaves, Nora couldn't help wondering what it might be like to belong at the Double M not just as a housekeeper, but as something more. Such thoughts were foolish, she reminded herself firmly. Blake had made it clear their arrangement was professional. He had offered her shelter and employment when she needed it most, but that didn't mean he wanted anything beyond a housekeeper. Still, as spring deepened into early summer and her time at the ranch stretched from weeks into a month, Nora found herself watching Blake with increasing interest, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he was amused. How gentle his calloused hands could be when examining a newborn calf. The rare occasions when he would join her on the porch at sunset. Their silence comfortable rather than awkward. These observations she kept carefully to herself, focusing instead on preparing for the baby's arrival. The small room between her bedroom and Blake's was gradually transformed into a nursery, with a cradle Jessie built from pine, blankets Nora sewed from fabric Blake brought from town, and a rocking chair Miguel's wife sent over from their homestead. Blake never commented on these preparations, but Nora noticed that whenever he returned from Clearwater Springs, he would bring something for the baby: a small stuffed bear, a silver rattle, a soft blanket. These gifts were always presented casually, left on the kitchen table with a mumbled explanation about seeing it in the store window or thought it might be useful. Each item touched Nora deeply, not just for the thoughtfulness they represented, but for what they implied that Blake was planning for her and the baby to remain at the Double M, at least for the foreseeable future. As her July due date approached, this realization brought both comfort and confusion. The Double M had become more of a home to her in 2 months than Clearwater Springs had in 6 years. Yet her future remained uncertain, her position dependent on Blake's continued goodwill. And then there were the feelings she couldn't quite suppress, the warmth that spread through her when Blake smiled at her across the dinner table. The way her heart quickened when their hands accidentally touched passing the coffee pot. The dreams that sometimes woke her in the night, leaving her flushed and confused. Such feelings were inappropriate, Nora reminded herself sternly. Blake had been kind to her when she needed kindness most, but that didn't mean he saw her as anything more than an employee, a woman in need of help. To imagine otherwise was to risk the security she'd found at the Double M security she couldn't afford to lose with a baby on the way. So Nora kept her growing feelings carefully contained, focusing instead on preparing for the child that would soon change her life forever. The baby, at least, was something she could openly love, openly plan for. Everything else, the uncertain future, her complicated feelings for Blake, would have to wait. Blake sat at his desk, ledger open before him, but his attention kept drifting to the sounds of Nora moving about the kitchen below. The familiar rhythm of her footsteps, the clatter of pots and pans, the occasional soft humming, these had become the soundtrack of his days at the ranch, a presence he'd grown accustomed to with surprising ease. 3 months ago, if anyone had suggested he would invite a pregnant, unmarried woman to live at the Double M, he would have laughed at the absurdity. Blake had built his life around self-sufficiency and independence, keeping the complications of other people's lives at arm's length. Yet here he was, his carefully ordered existence thoroughly disrupted by Nora Collins and her unborn child. The strangest part was that he didn't mind. Oh, he'd told himself repeatedly that it was a purely practical arrangement. The ranch needed a housekeeper, Nora needed employment and shelter. Simple economics, nothing more. But that explanation was wearing increasingly thin, even to his own ears. The truth, which Blake was reluctant to acknowledge even to himself, was that Nora's presence had filled a void he hadn't realized existed. The main house felt like a home now, rather than just a place to eat and sleep between work days. Meals had become something to look forward to rather than merely necessary sustenance. Even the ranch hands had been transformed by her influence, taking greater care with their appearance and language, engaging in conversation rather than just shoveling food into their mouths in silence. And then there was Nora herself. Blake closed the ledger with a sigh, giving up any pretense of focusing on accounts. The plain fact was that he found himself thinking about her far too often for a man who claimed to want a simple, uncomplicated life. He admired her resilience, the quiet dignity with which she'd faced rejection from her community. He respected her work ethic, the way she managed the household despite her advancing pregnancy. He enjoyed their conversations, discovering that beneath her reserved exterior was a woman of intelligence and unexpected humor. And if he was being entirely honest, he was increasingly drawn to her physically as well. Pregnancy had softened her features, adding a fullness to her face and a glow to her skin that he found inexplicably appealing. Her honey-brown hair, usually pinned up during the day, sometimes came loose in tendrils that framed her face in a way that made it difficult for him to maintain his customary detachment. Blake ran a hand over his face, frustrated with the direction of his thoughts. Getting involved with Nora would be incredibly unwise. She was vulnerable, dependent on him for her livelihood and shelter. Any overture from him could be interpreted as pressure, an expectation of something beyond professional services. Moreover, she was expecting another man's child, a complication Blake had never envisioned in his life. While he'd grown surprisingly comfortable with the idea of a baby at the ranch, actually raising another man's child as his own was an entirely different matter. A knock at his study door interrupted these troubling reflections. "Come in," he called, grateful for the distraction. Jesse entered, hat in hand, his weathered face serious. "Boss, we've got trouble at the north boundary. Looks like Harlan Jenkins has moved his fence again, cutting off access to the creek." Blake swore under his breath. Jenkins, whose small ranch bordered the Double M to the north, had been a persistent problem since purchasing the property 2 years earlier. The man seemed determined to encroach on Blake's land whenever possible, particularly the valuable water access along the creek. "How far has he moved it this time?" Blake asked, already reaching for his hat. "Good 30 yards into our property. His boys are out there now, setting posts." Blake nodded grimly. "Saddle my horse, let's go have a word with Jenkins." As they headed downstairs, Nora emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Blake's expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Boundary dispute with Jenkins," Blake replied shortly. "Nothing for you to worry about. I'll be back for dinner." "Be careful," Nora said softly. "Mr. Jenkins has a reputation for being difficult." Blake paused, surprised by her concern. "You know Jenkins only by reputation, Mrs. Abernathy mentioned him before she left. She said he's been trying to force you to sell that northern section for months." "Mrs. Abernathy talks too much," Blake muttered, though he was privately impressed by Nora's awareness of the situation. "Don't worry, I can handle Jenkins." She didn't look convinced, but nodded anyway. "Dinner will be ready at 6, as usual." As Blake rode north with Jesse and Caleb, his mind kept returning to the worry in Nora's eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had expressed genuine concern for his welfare. The sensation was both unfamiliar and oddly warming. When they reached the disputed boundary, Blake's mood darkened immediately. Not only had Jenkins moved his fence well onto Double M property, but he'd also positioned 3 armed ranch hands to guard the work. Jenkins himself sat on his horse supervising, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl beneath his drooping mustache. He straightened as Blake approached, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Matheson," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "About time you showed up." Blake reined in his horse, keeping his voice level despite his anger. "You're on my land, Jenkins, again. According to my survey, this creek is the natural boundary between our properties," Jenkins replied smugly. "I'm just correcting an oversight." "The boundary was established when I purchased this land 15 years ago," Blake said. "It's clearly marked on the county records 50 yards north of the creek," Jenkins shrugged. "Records can be mistaken. My surveyor says different." "Your surveyor is either incompetent or a liar," Blake replied. "Either way, you're moving that fence back today." One of Jenkins' men stepped forward, hand on his gun. "You calling Mr. Jenkins a liar?" "Stand down, Parker," Jenkins ordered, though he looked pleased by the man's aggression. "No need for that, yet," he turned back to Blake. "Look, Matheson, we both know this land would serve my operation better than yours. I've made you fair offers, and I've declined them, repeatedly." "Maybe it's time to reconsider," Jenkins suggested, "before things get complicated." The threat wasn't subtle. Blake had heard rumors that Jenkins had driven other small ranchers out of business through similar tactics: intimidation, sabotage, mysterious cattle disappearances. But the Double M wasn't a small operation, and Blake wasn't easily intimidated. "Here's what's going to happen," Blake said calmly. "You and your men are going to pull up those posts, move back to the proper boundary, and stay there. Otherwise, my next stop is the sheriff's office in Clearwater Springs." Jenkins laughed. "Sheriff Davis, we play poker every Wednesday." "I wouldn't count on him taking your side." "Then I'll take it to the territorial court," Blake countered. "I have the original deeds and surveys. Do you really want to explain to a judge why you're repeatedly trespassing on my property?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Jenkins' face. Legal battles were expensive and time-consuming, even for someone with connections. "You're making an enemy, Matheson," he said finally. "Over what? A strip of land and some water rights." "Over what's rightfully mine," Blake replied evenly. "I don't take kindly to theft, whether it's at gunpoint or with survey stakes." The standoff continued for several tense moments, neither man willing to back down. Finally, Jenkins spat on the ground and turned to his men. "Pull up the posts. We'll settle this another way." Blake watched impassively as Jenkins' men grudgingly began removing the fence posts they'd just set. Only when they had loaded their equipment and ridden back toward Jenkins' ranch did he allow himself to relax slightly. "He'll try again," Jesse predicted as they rode back toward the Double M. "Jenkins isn't one to give up easily." "I know," Blake agreed, Post a man at this boundary for the next few weeks, and tell the boys to keep an eye out for any of Jenkins' men on our property." The confrontation had left him with a sour taste in his mouth and a growing sense of unease. Jenkins wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. His parting words, "We'll settle this another way," suggested he was already planning his next move. As they approached the ranch house, Blake was surprised to see how late it had gotten. The sun was already low in the western sky, painting the landscape in golden hues. The dispute with Jenkins had taken longer than he'd anticipated. When he entered the house, the aroma of roast beef and fresh bread greeted him. Nora was setting the table, her movements slower and more deliberate as her pregnancy advanced. She looked up as he entered, relief evident in her expression. "You're back," she said simply. "I was beginning to worry." "Jenkins was being more stubborn than usual," Blake replied, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "But we reached an understanding. For now." Nora studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he was downplaying the situation. "Dinner's ready whenever you are," she said finally. "The others are washing up at the pump." As they ate, Blake found himself watching Nora more closely than usual. She seemed tired, one hand occasionally moving to her lower back as if to ease discomfort. Her due date was less than 3 weeks away, he realized with a start. Soon there would be a baby at the double Emma reality that still seemed somewhat abstract despite the cradle in the upstairs room and the tiny clothes Nora had been sewing. "Are you feeling all right?" He asked when the meal was finished and the ranch hands had departed for the bunkhouse. Nora looked surprised by the question. "Yes, just the usual discomforts. Dr. Miller said everything is progressing normally when he visited last week." Blake nodded, remembering the elderly physician's visit. He'd arranged for the doctor to come to the ranch rather than making Nora travel to town, conscious of how uncomfortable such a journey would be in her condition. "If you need anything," he began awkwardly. "You've already provided more than I could have hoped for," Nora interrupted gently. "This place, this opportunity, I don't know what would have happened to me and the baby without your help." The gratitude in her eyes made Blake uncomfortable. "It's a fair exchange," he said gruffly. "Your work for room and board." "We both know it's more than that," Nora replied softly. "You've given me back my dignity when others were determined to take it away. That's not something I can repay with housekeeping." Blake didn't know how to respond. She was right, of course. Their arrangement had evolved beyond a simple employment situation, though he was reluctant to examine exactly what it had become instead. "You should rest," he said finally, rising from the table. "I'll finish clearing up." "That's not necessary, please," he insisted. "You look tired." After a moment's hesitation, Nora nodded. "Thank you. I am rather exhausted today." As she made her way upstairs, Blake began gathering the dishes, his mind troubled by conflicting thoughts. The confrontation with Jenkins had left him uneasy, concerned about potential retaliation. And now there was Nora, clearly nearing her time, bringing a new vulnerability to the ranch that he hadn't fully considered until now. The Double M had always been his sanctuary, the place where he answered to no one and needed nothing beyond what his own hands could provide. Now it had become something else, a home to a woman and soon a child, both dependent on him in ways he'd never anticipated. The realization should have alarmed him, should have made him regret his impulsive offer 3 months ago. Instead, as Blake washed the dishes in the kitchen that had become Nora's domain, he found himself contemplating a future he'd never imagined, one that included not just cattle and land, but a family. The thought both terrified and intrigued him. And as the night deepened around the quiet ranch house, Blake Matheson began to wonder if perhaps his carefully constructed solitude had been less a choice than a defense against precisely the kind of connection he now found himself considering. The pains began shortly after midnight, startling Nora from a fitful sleep. At first, she tried to dismiss them as the false contractions Dr. Miller had warned might occur in the final weeks. But as they grew stronger and more regular, she realized with a mixture of excitement and fear that her time had come nearly 2 weeks earlier than expected. For several hours, she paced her room, breathing through each contraction as Mrs. Abernathy had advised during her last visit. The older woman had experienced childbirth 5 times herself and had shared practical wisdom that no doctor had thought to mention. When the pains come regular as clockwork and take your breath away, that's when you call for help, she'd said. Not before, or they'll just tell you to wait. And not too much after, or things might move faster than you're prepared for. By dawn, Nora knew she needed assistance. The contractions were coming every 10 minutes, strong enough to make her grip the bedpost and breathe in measured counts. Gathering her courage, she made her way to Blake's door and knocked softly. For a moment. There was silence, and Nora wondered if she'd have to knock louder. Then came the sound of movement, and the door opened to reveal Blake, hair tousled from sleep, wearing only trousers hastily pulled on. "Nora," his voice was rough with sleep, but his eyes sharpened immediately at the sight of her pale face. "What's wrong?" "The baby," she managed before another contraction seized her. She gripped the door frame, breathing carefully until it passed. "It's coming, earlier than we expected." Blake's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Now, are you sure?" "Quite sure," Nora replied with a strained smile. "The pains have been regular for hours." "I'll get the doctor," Blake said, already reaching for his shirt. "Jessie can ride to town faster than the wagon could make it." "There may not be time," Nora warned. "First babies often come slow, but Dr. Miller said sometimes they surprise you, and Clearwater Springs is nearly 3 hours round trip, even riding hard." Blake paused, clearly weighing options. "Miguel's wife," he said suddenly. "Elena has helped deliver half the babies in the area. I'll send Caleb to fetch her. Their homestead is only 4 miles east." Nora nodded gratefully, another contraction building. This one was stronger, causing her to gasp despite her determination to remain calm. Without hesitation, Blake moved to her side, offering his arm for support. "Let's get you back to your room," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Then I'll wake the boys and send for Elena." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and waiting. Elena arrived shortly after sunrise, a small woman with capable hands and a reassuring presence. She examined Nora briefly before declaring that the baby was indeed coming, but likely not for several more hours. "First babies take their time," she said in accented English. "We prepare, we wait, we pray." Blake had retreated downstairs after Elena's arrival, clearly uncomfortable with the intimate nature of the situation. But he made himself useful, keeping water boiling in the kitchen, sending Jessie to town for the doctor as a precaution, and pacing the front porch with such regularity that Nora could track his movements from her window. As morning stretched into afternoon, Nora's labor intensified. Elena remained a calm presence, wiping Nora's brow with cool cloths, helping her walk when the pains allowed, and offering quiet encouragement when they didn't. "You are strong," she said during a particularly difficult contraction. "Like the women who first came to this wild land. They had babies in wagons, in tents, sometimes with only their husbands to help. You have it better: a good roof, clean bed, someone who cares watching over you." "Blake is my employer," Nora corrected weakly when the pain subsided. "He's been kind," but Elena made a dismissive sound. "I have eyes, señorita. The way he looks at you when he thinks no one sees, the way you say his name, there is more than employment between you." Nora flushed, too exhausted to argue but unwilling to acknowledge the truth in Elena's words. Whatever feelings might be developing between her and Blake, they remained unspoken, complicated by her condition and their respective positions. As the afternoon waned, Nora's labor reached its peak. The contractions came one after another, barely giving her time to catch her breath. Elena's calm demeanor never wavered, but Nora could sense a new urgency in her instructions. "The baby comes soon," she announced after checking Nora's progress. "You must push with the next pain." Nora nodded, gathering her remaining strength. Fear mingled with determination as she faced the final stage of this journey alone, without family, without the child's father, in a place that 3 months ago had been unknown to her. Yet not entirely alone, she realized. Elena's steadfast presence, the distant sound of Blake's footsteps on the porch below, even the knowledge that the ranch hands were nearby. ready to help if needed, all reminded her that she had found an unexpected community at the Double M. With that thought giving her courage, Nora bore down with the next contraction, following Alina's instructions through a haze of pain and exertion. Time lost meaning as her world narrowed to the overwhelming task of bringing her child into the world, and then, suddenly, it was over. A sharp cry pierced the room, and Alina was placing a tiny, red-faced infant on Nora's chest. "A boy," Alina announced, her weathered face breaking into a wide smile. "Healthy and strong." Nora stared in wonder at the small being who had been part of her for so long and was now a separate person, her son. Tears streamed down her face as she counted his fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of his miniature features. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, using the name she'd chosen months ago not for the baby's absent father, but for her own father, a good man whose memory she cherished. Alina busied herself with the practical aftermath of childbirth, cleaning and attending to Nora with gentle efficiency. When everything was settled, she opened the bedroom door to find Blake sitting on the top step of the staircase, head in his hands. "Senor Matheson," she called softly, "come meet the newest resident of the Double M." Blake rose slowly, his usual composure replaced by an almost boyish uncertainty. He approached the doorway cautiously, as if afraid of intruding. "It's all right," Nora said, adjusting the blanket around the now sleeping infant. "We're both decent." Blake entered the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the tiny bundle in Nora's arms. For a long moment he simply stared, an expression of wonder gradually replacing his apprehension. "A boy," Alina informed him proudly. "Born at exactly 4:17 this afternoon, 7 pounds by my estimation, though we'll let the doctor confirm when he arrives." "He's perfect," Blake said softly, surprising both women with the emotion in his voice. "Absolutely perfect." Nora felt fresh tears threatening at the genuine awe in his expression. "Would you like to hold him?" Blake looked startled by the offer. "I've never held a baby before." "There is no better time to learn," Alina said practically, already moving to guide his arms into the proper position. With obvious trepidation, Blake accepted the small bundle, his large hands cradling the infant with exaggerated care. Thomas stirred slightly but didn't wake, seeming content in the rancher's awkward embrace. "I've named him Thomas," Nora said, watching the tableau with a full heart. "After my father." "Thomas," Blake repeated, testing the name. "It suits him." Alina, observing the scene with knowing eyes, discreetly excused herself to prepare some broth for Nora, leaving the new mother and the rancher alone with the sleeping infant. "Thank you," Nora said after a moment of comfortable silence. "For what?" Blake asked, still gazing at Thomas with fascination. "For everything. For taking us in when no one else would. For creating a place where my son could be born safely, where we could be treated with dignity." Blake finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't need to thank me, Nora. Having you here, both of you," he paused, struggling to find words. "The ranch feels like a home now. It never really did before." The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken implications. Nora wanted to respond, to acknowledge the depth of feeling his words stirred in her, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her, the day's exertions finally claiming their toll. Blake seemed to notice her fatigue. Carefully returning Thomas to her arms, he said, "You should rest. Alina says Dr. Miller should arrive before nightfall to check on you both." Nora nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy. "Will you come back later, to see Thomas again?" "Try to keep me away," Blake replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "This is a day worth celebrating at the Double M." As he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, Nora looked down at her sleeping son. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Collins," she whispered. "You've already worked one miracle today, making a solitary rancher smile like that. I wonder what other changes you'll bring to our lives." With that thought warming her heart, Nora drifted into an exhausted sleep, her son cradled securely in her arms. The arrival of Thomas Collins at the Double M changed everything, though not in the ways Blake might have anticipated. He had braced himself for disruption, sleepless nights, incessant crying, the general chaos he associated with infants. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the tiny newcomer would establish himself as the center of ranch life, drawing everyone into his orbit with an irresistible gravitational pull. Jesse, the grizzled foreman who claimed to have no use for young'uns, could be found making ridiculous faces at Thomas during his morning coffee. Miguel carved a series of small wooden animals for when the boy was old enough to play. Even taciturn Sam would hum old cavalry songs when it was his turn to hold the baby while Nora prepared dinner. Most surprising to Blake was his own reaction. He had assumed he would maintain a polite distance from Nora's child, acknowledging the boy's presence without becoming overly involved. Instead, he found himself lingering in the house more than usual, offering to hold Thomas while Nora attended to household tasks, studying the infant's changing features with fascination. Within weeks, Thomas had developed a distinct personality, alert, observant, with a serious expression that could suddenly transform into a toothless grin that made Blake's chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. The baby seemed particularly content in Blake's arms, often falling asleep against his shoulder when all of Nora's gentle rocking had failed to soothe him. "He trusts you," Nora observed one evening as Blake paced the front room with a finally sleeping Thomas. "He knows he's safe with you." The simple statement affected Blake more deeply than he cared to admit. Trust was something he had rarely sought from others, preferring the clarity of business arrangements and clearly defined boundaries. Yet this small being trusted him implicitly, without conditions or expectations. As summer turned to fall, Blake found himself contemplating the future with growing uncertainty. Nora had been at the Double M for 6 months now, far longer than he had initially anticipated when offering her employment. Thomas was thriving, and Nora had fully recovered from childbirth, resuming her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had transformed the ranch house into a true home. Yet their arrangement remained undefined beyond employer and employee. Blake had never clarified how long Nora might stay, and she had never asked. They existed in a comfortable limbo, their daily interactions warm but careful, both seemingly afraid to disturb the delicate balance they had established. The situation might have continued indefinitely, if not for an unexpected visitor on a crisp October afternoon. Blake was in the barn, discussing winter preparations with Jesse, when a stranger rode into the yard, a well-dressed man on an expensive horse, looking distinctly out of place against the working ranch backdrop. "Can I help you?" Blake asked, approaching the newcomer with guarded curiosity. The man dismounted smoothly, removing his hat to reveal carefully styled brown hair and a clean-shaven face that suggested city living rather than frontier hardship. "I'm looking for Nora Collins," he said, his accent marking him as educated, possibly Eastern. "I was told in town that she might be found here." Blake's instinctive wariness sharpened. "Who's asking?" "Thomas Parker," the man replied, extending his hand. "I believe Miss Collins and I are acquainted." Blake didn't take the offered hand, his mind racing to place the name. Then realization struck. Thomas Parker, the man who had abandoned Nora when she told him of her pregnancy, the coward who had fled to California rather than face his responsibilities. "You're not welcome here," Blake said flatly. Parker's pleasant expression faltered slightly. "I understand your caution, Mr. Matheson, Blake Matheson. This is my ranch, and I'll decide who's welcome on it." "Mr. Matheson," Parker continued smoothly, "I assure you my intentions are honorable. I've come to make things right with Nora." "After abandoning her," Blake's voice hardened. "After leaving her to face the town's judgment alone, after missing the birth of your own child," Parker had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I made a terrible mistake," he admitted. "I panicked when Nora told me about the baby. I wasn't ready for that responsibility. But I've had time to reconsider, to grow up a bit." "How convenient for you," Blake said coldly. Before Parker could respond, the front door of the house opened, and Nora appeared with Thomas in her arms. She stopped abruptly at the sight of her visitor, her face draining of color. "Thomas," she whispered, the name clearly referring to the man rather than the child. "Hello, Nora," Parker said, his voice softening. You look well. Blake watched as a series of emotions crossed Nora's face: shock, confusion, hurt, and finally a cautious wariness. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward them, holding her son a little tighter. What are you doing here? She asked directly, Parker's eyes fixed on the baby, widening slightly. Is that your son? Nora confirmed. Also named Thomas, though not after you, after my father. Parker swallowed visibly. May I see him? Nora hesitated, then nodded stiffly. She turned the baby slightly so Parker could see his face, but made no move to hand him over. He's beautiful, Nora, Parker said softly. He has your eyes. What do you want, Thomas? Nora asked, her voice steady despite the tension Blake could see in her posture. To make amends, Parker replied. To do right by you and our son. He glanced at Blake before continuing. I've established myself in Denver now. I have a good position with a banking firm, prospects for advancement. I can provide for you both properly. Blake felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Parker was offering Nora exactly what she had been denied: respectability, security, a father for her child, the legitimate family she deserved. You want us to come to Denver? Nora asked, sounding neither eager nor dismissive. I want us to be a family, Parker clarified. I've missed you, Nora. These past months have shown me what a fool I was to leave. I'd like a chance to make it up to you, to both of you. The sincerity in Parker's voice sounded genuine, even to Blake's skeptical ears. The man appeared truly repentant, eager to rectify his past mistakes. He was well-dressed, clearly prosperous, and spoke with the confidence of someone secure in his position. In short, he could offer Nora everything Blake hadn't. This is unexpected, Nora said finally. I need time to think. Parker nodded quickly. Of course, I'm staying at the hotel in Clearwater Springs for the next few days. Take all the time you need. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package. This is for the baby, just a small token. Nora accepted it with her free hand, her expression unreadable. Thank you. An awkward silence fell over the group. Blake wanted nothing more than to order Parker off his property, but he recognized that this wasn't his decision to make. Nora had every right to consider the offer, to weigh the benefits for herself and her son. I should go, Parker said finally. Let you consider what I've said. But Nora, he stepped closer, his expression earnest. I mean what I say. I want to make things right. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Blake couldn't bring himself to look at Nora, afraid of what he might see in her face: hope, perhaps, or excitement at the prospect of a legitimate family for her son. Blake, Nora began. You should consider his offer, Blake interrupted, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. For Thomas's sake, if nothing else. Without waiting for her response, he turned and strode toward the barn, needing distance to process the sudden threat to the life he'd grown accustomed to, the life that included Nora and Thomas as central figures. Jesse, who had witnessed the entire exchange, followed him into the barn. Boss, not now, Jesse, Blake said sharply. Yes, now, the foreman countered, undeterred by Blake's tone. That city fella, he's the baby's father. Blake nodded grimly, busying himself with checking a saddle that didn't need checking. And he wants to take Miss Nora and little Thomas to Denver, apparently. Jesse was silent for a moment, watching Blake's agitated movements. And you're just going to let them go? Blake's hands stilled on the leather. It's not my decision to make. The hell it isn't, Jesse said bluntly. You love them. The simple statement hit Blake like a physical blow. He started to deny it automatically, then stopped, the protest dying on his lips, because Jesse was right. Somewhere between offering Nora shelter and watching her cradle her newborn son, between awkward meals at the beginning and comfortable evenings on the porch, he had fallen in love with her, with both of them. It doesn't matter, he said finally. Parker is Thomas's father. He can give them both legitimacy, security, and you can't, Jesse challenged. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Jesse insisted, unless you're too stubborn or too scared to admit it. Blake turned to face his foreman, surprised by the man's directness. Since when do you involve yourself in my personal affairs? Since you've been happier these past 6 months than in all the 10 years I've known you, Jesse replied without hesitation. since that woman and her baby have brought more life to this ranch than all your cattle put together. Since you started acting like a man with something to live for beyond the next season's calves." Blake had no ready response to that assessment. It was true that Nora and Thomas had changed him, changed the ranch in ways he hadn't fully acknowledged until faced with the prospect of losing them. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "Beg her to stay, compete with the father of her child." "I'd have you be honest," Jesse said simply. "With her and with yourself. If you love her, tell her so. If you want her and that boy to be your family, ask them to be. But for God's sake, don't just stand aside and watch them ride away because you're too proud or too scared to fight for what matters." With that, the foreman turned and left the barn, leaving Blake alone with thoughts more turbulent than any he'd faced in years. Nora sat in the rocking chair by the nursery window, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms as she contemplated the day's unexpected development. Thomas Parker's return had shaken her more than she cared to admit, stirring up emotions she'd thought long resolved. 6 months ago, she would have given anything to see him ride up to take responsibility for their child. She had loved him once or thought she had enough to believe his promises of marriage, enough to surrender to his persuasive embraces. His abandonment had been a crushing blow, not just to her heart but to her entire future. Now he had returned, offering exactly what she had once desperately wanted: marriage, respectability, a father for her son. He seemed genuinely repentant, genuinely eager to make amends. The position in Denver sounded promising, offering stability and opportunities for their child that frontier life might not provide. By any rational measure, she should be grateful for this second chance. Yet as she contemplated leaving the Double M, Nora felt only a profound reluctance that had nothing to do with practical considerations and everything to do with the taciturn rancher who had avoided her since Parker's departure. Blake's reaction to Thomas Parker's arrival had been difficult to interpret. He had been coldly protective initially, then suddenly distant, practically pushing her to consider Parker's offer. His abrupt withdrawal hurt more than Nora wanted to acknowledge, confirming her suspicion that despite their comfortable coexistence over the past months, Blake saw her primarily as an employee, one he was perhaps even relieved to potentially be rid of. A soft knock at the nursery door interrupted her reflections. "Come in," she called quietly, careful not to wake Thomas. To her surprise, it was Blake who entered, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Is he asleep?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. "Just now," Nora replied. "He was fussier than usual today." Blake nodded, moving to stand by the window. Outside, the autumn sun was setting, painting the ranch in gold and amber hues. For several minutes, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like a physical presence. "Parker seems sincere," Blake said finally, his back still to her. "About wanting to make amends." "Yes," Nora agreed cautiously, "he does. Denver would offer advantages for Thomas. Schools, opportunities, society." Nora studied Blake's rigid posture, trying to understand what lay beneath his detached assessment. "Those things are important," she acknowledged, "but they're not everything." Blake turned then, his expression carefully neutral. "What else matters?" The question seemed simple, yet Nora sensed layers of meaning beneath it. "Love," she said softly, "belonging, being somewhere you're truly wanted, not just tolerated or accepted out of obligation. And you don't think Parker wants you, both of you?" "I think he believes he does," Nora replied thoughtfully. "But Thomas has always been guided by what he thinks he should want, what society expects of him. It's why he left in the first place. The reality of fatherhood didn't match his idealized vision of our future." "People can change," Blake observed. "They can," Nora agreed, "but usually not fundamentally. Thomas has always valued appearances, position, the approval of others. I suspect his offer has as much to do with assuaging his conscience as with genuine feeling for me or his son." Blake was silent for a moment, processing her words. "You're not planning to accept his proposal then?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond its surface meaning. Nora rose carefully, placing Thomas in his cradle before turning to face Blake directly. That depends, she said quietly. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay. Blake's carefully maintained neutrality faltered, a flash of vulnerability crossing his face before he could mask it. The double-M has been good for you and Thomas, he said, his voice not quite steady. You've both thrived here. We have, Nora agreed. But is that enough reason to decline a legitimate offer of marriage from my child's father, to choose continuing as your housekeeper over becoming Thomas Parker's wife? She was pushing him, she knew, forcing the conversation they had both carefully avoided for months. It was a risk Blake might retreat further, might confirm her worst fear that she had imagined the growing connection between them. No, Blake said after a long moment. It's not enough reason. Nora's heart sank, though she kept her expression composed. I see. But this might be, Blake continued, taking a step toward her. I love you, Nora. I love Thomas too, though I never expected to. I want you both to stay, not as my housekeeper and her child, but as my family. The simple declaration, spoken in Blake's straightforward manner, stole Nora's breath. Blake, I know I'm not Thomas Parker, he continued, words coming faster now as if he feared losing his courage. I don't have banking connections or city prospects. All I have is this ranch, my hands, and a heart that somehow ended up belonging to you without my quite realizing it. It's not much to offer against what Parker can provide, it's everything, Nora interrupted, tears filling her eyes. Everything that matters. Blake stared at her, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. You mean? I mean I love you too, Nora said simply. I have for months, though I convinced myself it was one-sided, that you saw me only as an employee you'd helped in a difficult time. Never, Blake said fervently. From the moment you transformed this house into a home, from the first time I held Thomas and saw you looking at us together, I've been fighting feelings I didn't think I was entitled to have. Why didn't you say anything? Nora asked softly. How could I? You were dependent on me for shelter, for employment. Any declaration would have seemed like pressure, like taking advantage of your vulnerability. Blake ran a hand through his hair in frustration. And then there was Thomas, not the baby, but his father. The shadow of the man who had a prior claim, who should have been here all along. Thomas Parker abandoned that claim when he left me to face disgrace alone, Nora said firmly. You've been more of a father to my son in 3 months than Thomas has in his entire life. As if hearing his name, the baby stirred in his cradle, making the small, snuffling sounds that usually preceded waking. Blake moved to the cradle instinctively, reaching down to gently rub Thomas's back in the soothing motion Nora had taught him. The simple, tender gesture crystallized everything for Nora. This was what mattered, not Denver society or banking positions, or even the conventional respectability that had once seemed so important. What mattered was this man who had defended her dignity, who had opened his home and his heart, who now stood over her son with the protective care of a true father. I won't go to Denver, she said with quiet certainty. This is where we belong, where Thomas belongs, with you. Blake looked up, his expression transformed by a joy so intense it nearly took her breath away. Are you sure? Parker can offer you marriage, legitimacy, and you can't, Nora challenged gently. Blake crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. Nora Collins, if you're asking whether I want to marry you, the answer is yes. I want to give my name to you and to Thomas, to make official what already feels true in my heart, that you're my family. Then ask me properly, Nora whispered, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Blake smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that transformed his usually serious face. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her, still holding her hands in his. Nora Collins, will you marry me? Will you make this ranch a true home? Raise your son here with me as his father. Build a life together that has nothing to do with what anyone in Clearwater Springs or anywhere else might think, and everything to do with the love we've found. Tears spilled freely down Nora's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she said simply, with all my heart, yes. Blake rose and pulled her gently into his arms. Their first kiss was tentative, a soft exploration that quickly deepened into something more certain, a promise sealed between them that needed no witnesses beyond the sleeping child, and the walls of the home they now truly shared. When they finally parted, Nora rested her head against Blake's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What will you tell Thomas Parker?" he asked quietly. "The truth," Nora replied, her voice soft but resolute. "That he made a choice, and while I once hoped for a future with him, I found a home with you." With their newfound commitment, Blake and Nora embraced the journey ahead, ready to build a family and a life filled with love at the Double M Ranch.